museum back to life.
You know, people sit out on the front porch hoping people will come by.
Go forth and do good.
It's insane. I have the most understanding wife in the world.
I treat everybody the same thing.
Oh, that's the other thing I love about Marietta. It's like a melting pot.
You are listening to Marietta Stories. Each week, veteran podcaster Bill Nowicki brings you the heartwarming, interesting, and fun stories from the people that make the community of Marietta, Georgia, a place to call home. Here's your host, Bill Nowicki.
All right, here I have Dr. Albert Slomovitz, who I've got to be friends with from helping him with his podcast, Rabbi Jesus, My Brother. And I thought it'd be great. He's a Marietta guy, and I thought it'd be great to get him on the show. So welcome, Dr. Rabbi Albert Slomovitz.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And where did you grow up? I don't even know that.
I grew up in North Miami Beach, down in Florida, born in New York, raised down there. Had a good time, but the interesting part was post-high school and college, that's when I returned to New York. It sort of changed my view on the world a little bit. I went from a junior college in South Florida to Columbia University in New York and the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was taking 21 credits a semester, so you go from one worldview to a much larger intellectually based view.
All right. Well, let's talk about your growing up. Did you come from a large family?
No. Mother, father, my brother and my sister and myself. Unfortunately, my parents divorced, so myself being the oldest placed a lot of responsibilities on me in a personal way. And the synagogue was always part of our lives. And I would say, looking back, that it became a larger part due to the separation of my parents. So I was looking for, I guess, something solid and some values I could adhere to, and frankly, some personalities that I could imitate as well, and that was my spiritual leader, my religious school principal, like that.
Did you have a rabbi that you kind of used as a mentor or someone that you went to?
Not especially. He was a mentor in terms of, if I became a rabbi, what I would like to be. I saw his relationship with his congregation, and it was quite exceptional, I must say. He had on a typical Saturday morning, which is when Jewish people go to services, we would have 400, 500 people, just like a regular weekend, nothing special. And that was, and he was really a force. And when he spoke, people listened, and he got things done. So I was fortunate to have him at that time of my life.
What do you think drew people to come to synagogue?
I think it was a combination of his learning, his personality, and also the way he delivered his sermon. They were never read. He would start talking, and he would make excellent eye contact with the congregation. I remember once he finished up a sermon and turned around, and one of the congregants got up, and he said, "And God bless you." His name is Max Lipschitz. And I said, wow, for someone just spontaneously to get up and thank the rabbi. I said, he's doing something right.
Sounds like it had a fairly large impact on you, and religion was a big part of your life. How did you decide to go up to New York, and how did you establish connections up there and the whole 9 yards?
My mother, actually, who pushed me, there was this joint program I referred to earlier, and you had to apply for it, and it was part-time going to seminary, part-time to Columbia University. A lot of studying. But I went initially with the goal to be an educator. I had received a few scholarships to go up there to study with the idea that I would get educated and come back and work in a religious school, a Jewish religious school, as a principal, vice principal, something like that. Once I went up into this program, I realized that being an educator was just one of many possibilities. I think I was transformed to some extent by going up, and then the people who had given me a scholarship said, wow, you want to go on? Because that was undergraduate, and to go to a seminary is another 5 years. So you're really making a commitment. I will tell you a sidebar here. I was once taking over for a local rabbi in Miami Shores, Florida, when I was going as an educator. He said, can you take over Friday night services? And I said, I'm not prepared to do that. I said, I'm in the education side, not the rabbinic side. He said, don't worry about it. He said, we'll have a small crowd, and I'll tell you what pages to say. And so I did it, and I spoke, and I think it was that moment that it all came together for me. A lot of people have that moment where you say, oh, I think I know what I'm supposed to be doing. So other people had said education, and this was kind of like education, but not. So I think that was my moment of awakening, that this was what I was supposed to do.
So what was it about when you were standing in front of that group of people? Did you see people looking back at you in a certain way, or did you feel inspired?
I think it's all that. I mean, now that I'm older and I'm studying the biblical prophets, you know, people spoke, or the biblical leaders, and they said that they had some sort of certitude from someplace that God spoke to them, etc. So for modern people, that's not a criterion that we follow. I think it's something because it combined teaching, which I was already interested in, with the affirmation from the community and that notion of just you have this sense of belonging. People are afraid to speak publicly, and there's classes on how to overcome that. But for me, for the most part, thankfully, that it's an opportunity. It's not a place of being afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have an opportunity to affect a lot of people like you do now when you're a professor and you're an author. But let's talk about the military, because that was another big part of your life.
Right. I was, as I mentioned, 5 years of rabbinical school. And if you had spoken to me halfway through or 3/4 through, I was going to take a congregation like everyone else. And there is a need for rabbis, and there was even sort of a larger need back then because there were fewer seminaries. And in my last year of school, I opened a magazine. We were living in New Jersey. The seminary was in New York. First year in Israel, by the way. And we lived in Jerusalem, my wife and I. I saw a rabbi in a Navy uniform, and he was talking about the Naval Reserves. Now, that weekend, I was doing youth group work. Our youth group was going to his temple, and I ran into him, and I said, "Hi." So
serendipity.
Yeah, I think maybe maybe it was supposed to be. He saw that I was interested. He started talking to me, and I kept listening. And before I know it, I'm going to Newark, New Jersey for my medical exam and all the paperwork. And I tell people I signed up for 3 years, and it turned into 20. 3 turned into 20. And the motivations were I wanted to work with people of all faiths. And still teaching as rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. I wanted to show some affinity for America, that I love the country so much I was willing to serve. So I was ordained one day, sworn in the next. Just boom, boom. It was a wonderful 20-year career.
Tell me about that journey for you, because I guess, if I listen to what you just said, you were really surrounded a lot by Jewish folks, and having to transfer some of your knowledge to non-Jewish folks must have been interesting in a whole different world for you.
Yes, it was. And again, that's just instinct. I was just having a conversation with another friend who's a retired chaplain, and you have to go into the military or the university, or I'm now a police chaplain with Cobb County Police, that you know that you're serving everybody. And so the trick is to find a linkage between the two, like, who are you? This is me. And of course, it's interesting that most people who are Christians, even some Muslims, immediately when I came in the Navy, they said, "Oh, great, you're a rabbi." I've never met a rabbi. I've met a Jewish person before, but never a rabbi. And I have like 20 questions I want to ask you. So I found right away that there was this sort of stratum of people from highest ranking to lowest ranking who were just naturally interested in this. And sometimes in the weirdest places, I would get asked a lot of questions in the gym, just changing clothes. So I think once people felt comfortable with you and they saw that you weren't going to bite off their head about something, they asked.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm sure you have some really interesting things. When I first moved down south, I grew up Roman Catholic, and I remember someone said that on Ash Wednesday, "Hey, you have something on your head," right. And I didn't realize, living up north, that there were people that had no idea what a Roman Catholic was, and I suspect you found the same thing.
Yes. Picture in the military, there's in the Navy specifically for us, there was 1,000 chaplains, 1,000 of everybody, all kinds, and 10 rabbis. So the chances of any person being in proximity to a Jewish chaplain were very limited. Mm-hmm. We would wait about 2 months or a month before a major holiday, go up to our commanding officer and say, here's a memo for, let's say, Passover is coming up, and here are the times of services and Seder meals, so sign this direction, which I was going to say, let my people go, but it's too easy. But to let the people go to special services, like time off, like it's a legitimate holiday. So I was once in Norfolk Naval Base, and I carried this paperwork, it was about Passover, up to a 2-star admiral. All he had to do was sign it. And that would have affected coverage for 10,000 people to have off for Passover. So he signs it, and he says, Chaplain, can I ask you a question? Of course, what are you going to say? Yes, sir. I mean, you have no choice. I said, yes, sir. He said, I've been signing these memos for the longest time, but between you and me, I'm really not sure what Passover is. Okay. So we had a nice conversation about the Seder meal being the Lord's Supper meal and Jesus coming to, actually, I could answer him better now than then, but Jesus coming to Jerusalem during the Passover holiday and all the linkages, and he said, oh, I never knew, and thank you very much. I, of course, left, and I was glad for the opportunity to talk with him, but amazed that someone of that rank didn't have an awareness, and I must say that was, people ask me, was there prejudice? Did you find prejudice in the military? Out of 100, maybe 1 or 2%. The other 97, 98% was simply people not knowing. They didn't have any frame of reference. And let me throw this in. As of this moment, I think there's about 330 million people in America. And I often ask folks, if I'm teaching or something, how many do you think are Jews? What is the percent of Jewish population? They'll put out 20 million, 30 million, whatever. And I say, we wish there's under 6 million people, Jewish people in America. And
is that practicing Jews?
Well, that's if you count everybody. That's if you count everybody. So someone that says, yeah, I think 50 years ago I was born Jewish, never did anything else. So do the numbers. I mean, it's less than 2%. I mean, it's so there's not that many of us around. So the opportunity for me, either in the military or as a university professor, although in the university I teach American history, so I don't do this, but with my now nonprofit, I think that we make a mistake when we assume that people know things that we know, but maybe they don't.
Mm-hmm. Especially down south, I can't imagine, compared to some other states, we're probably very low on that list.
Well, think about it. Yeah, I mean, I've had friends who are Catholic and who had, people had issues with them. I mean, again, I'll throw in American history. John Kennedy running for president in 1960, and his religion, his faith, was an issue. So in many ways, that's, almost 60 years ago, we've come far, but not far enough. And there's still voids, I would say, big gaps in what people know. Or the sadder thing is when people identify other people in the negative. So they'll say, oh, they have this belief, we don't have that. They believe in that person, well, we don't. And so we sort of tend to dredge up a lot of negative energy because we define who we are by separating from others.
Right. Yeah, we're going to get into that in a minute. Now, how did you end up after retiring from the military at Kennesaw?
We were in Pensacola, Florida. That was our last naval base. I was the senior chaplain there, Naval Air Station, Pensacola. And a shout out to all our military people and police and fire and all that. We had relatives here, pretty benign, but what was interesting at Kennesaw, which of course is much smaller than it is now, I was fortunate to have earned my PhD. While I was in the Navy, I went to Loyola University of Chicago for 2 degrees, second master's in interfaith relations, and my PhD in American history. My first book, called The Fighting Rabbis, was published in 1999. So as I'm leaving the military, we kind of drove up here to East Cobb, drove out to Pensacola, drove out to Kennesaw, went to the history department with a copy of the book and said, hey, here's my book. And the chairman of the time said, oh, you have a book and your doctorate, come and teach for us. And then also I started a congregation in Alpharetta part-time. So I was doing part-time work for about a decade, driving the highways and byways and learning all about Atlanta traffic.
I bet. And you talked about interfaith. I know that's a big part of your podcast and some of the latest books you've written. So talk a little bit about that, how it sounds like it got a little bit of a background. Give us the rest of the story on that. All right, I got Elizabeth Denny with me. Since we started Marietta Stories 3 years ago, Johnny Walker Realty has grown tremendously.
When I joined, I was the fourth agent besides Johnny and Carrie, so there were 6 of us. And now I believe there are 25 of us. So, yeah.
Man, somebody's got to cook for all those people when you have a company thing, don't you?
Thankfully, we have more cooks now, so it works out.
We got the Marietta Market at the square. We have one of the best farmers markets. Restaurants are great. There's lots to do around the square. Folks moved away from the square in the 80s. Now they're all coming back, and now's the time to work with Johnny Walker Realty. They're at 262 Church Street. You go to JohnnyWalkerRealty.com or call them up at
678-626-0403.
As I said earlier about this calling, I had 20 years in the Navy, and this year's my 20th year teaching at Kennesaw. So I figure that's sort of a signal that maybe it's time to do something else. I started writing a book 3 years ago about Matthew, that here I'm a rabbi writing a commentary to the book of Matthew, which is directed to the Jewish community. It's about Jesus, who is Jewish, as the Messiah, and so it's directed to the Jewish community. Then about a year or so ago, year and a half ago, somebody came to me and said, a book is nice, but it's like fireworks. It kind of sparks a little bit. You have this pretty explosion, and then it fades away. And I thought about that. It's not quite accurate because my first 2 books are still out there. I have one about history of rabbis in the military, the other one about racism in the U.S. Supreme Court. But there's some truth to that. So then I thought about it, I prayed about it, and I came up with a nonprofit organization called Jewish Christian Discovery Center. And I'm sort of off and running with that. And the premise is simple. Educate Christians, and Jews too, about the commonalities we have. Now, I must say that that's not just theoretical. America has, and the world has experienced these spasms of killings and violence and all that. And so this is a pushback against all that. You don't shoot at someone who's your brother, your sister, whatever, your spiritual brother and sister. So I guess there's multi-levels to this, but it's designed to reduce anti-Semitism, which is anti-Jewishness, and also to make the world a little bit kinder and wiser, I think, too, that people don't know that we are spiritually related.
So why don't you talk a little bit about specifics about things that Christians wouldn't necessarily know that are common things that you point out in your book?
Okay, well, it's kind of easy. For people who know the Bible, we read about Jesus as a child. And then there's one little incident when he's 12 for literally 3 days, and then he's a man. So there's a gap of about 30 years. And he's crucified when he's 32 or 33. And the Bible simply doesn't fill in that gap. What was his childhood like? What was his adolescence? What was his young adult life? So first I tell people that was the same thing as Moses. Moses is put in the water, right. Saved by the house of Pharaoh, the daughter of Pharaoh, then he's young man. What's interesting about that is, how does he maintain his Israelite identity if he's raised in the house of Pharaoh? If you had a choice between being in the house of Pharaoh, being Israel, you say, hey, I'll take the comfort of the house of Pharaoh. The Bible simply doesn't tell you, and it says, okay, make up your own mind, or just accept it that he was influenced enough by his mother who was nursing him, or whatever. One of the things that people ask me often is, where am I going to get the sources to study Jesus' life? Because it's not in the Bible at all. And so what I show them is that there were existing sources. So I take any child at the time, and I sort of extrapolate back. So if there was a Jewish child who lived at that time, what would their education be? And if you think about it, this was an educated man. If you read the Bible, they are asking him very detailed questions about marriage and life after death. And there's one scene, he's walking through the field and they say, "Teacher, can we pluck the grain and eat it because it's the Sabbath day and you're not supposed to be doing that? But if you're starving, you can do that." So, I mean, what I want to share with my Christian friends is that these are intricate Jewish questions that a layperson, someone who's not educated, would say, "I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. So I think you could, but I have no basis for that." He really was quite a highly educated Jewish person, and I think sometimes that background is not spoken about enough. That's one of the things I want to share with people. And the other thing is I want to talk about the neighborhood he was from. In the book, coming out soon, we have maps of the area around Nazareth, because I say that I think people do a disservice by saying Jesus of Nazareth. That was a small little, not even a town, I mean just sort of a teeny town, but within miles was a larger town called Sepphoris, and it had Romans and Jews and amphitheaters, and I mean it had all sorts of artisans and people. So what I'm showing people in the book is I have a map, and I give you distances between Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee and Tiberias. So basically I'm showing the neighborhood. If you're from this area and somebody says, "Where are you from?" and you say Smyrna, you say, "That's a nice little town, and I guess the entirety of your existence is in Smyrna." You're going to say, "No, I go down to Atlanta, I've been up to Kennesaw, et cetera, et cetera." So why don't we do the same for Jesus as well? So I'm trying to give people a very educated and I think non-biased view of who and what he was to help explain how he acted as an adult. For all of us, you can't judge us as adults without going back to our childhood. So that's what I'm doing.
And that's what we talked about, because your life was informed by your time in the Navy and being exposed to all the different folks. And it sounds like Jesus had that kind of environment, at least close by.
Yes, here's a wonderful example. A friend of mine at Kennesaw asked me to come to services, a professor. So he came to services, and he asked if he could look at the Torah scroll, which is our scroll of the 5 books of Moses. It's literally a scroll written in Hebrew. So that day we're reading Deuteronomy 6, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and then you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might." Well, when Jesus is asked in the book of Matthew, "Teacher, what are the 2 greatest commandments?" he says that one, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might." And I showed it to the professor friend, and he was absolutely frozen in place. And I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I've been going to church all my life. And I thought that when Jesus is asked, what are the 2 greatest commandments, I thought he sort of, this was his wisdom. Mm-hmm. And he made up this first one, which sounds really nice. He said, "I had no idea that it came from the Hebrew Bible." I said, "Not only that," I said, "it's not only that, but if you ask any child in the sanctuary here, they learn this as an 8-year-old. So the minute the children are able to study prayers, this is one that you almost have to kind of memorize. And every time you go to services. So here's Jesus as a man being asked a very serious question, reverting back to his childhood education, which I can almost prove, not 100%, but in the 90s, because you have, historically, I have evidence that, yes, that's what you taught your children, and it's still taught today. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's a wonderful example of things that most people don't know, but they really should.
That's fascinating. What's the name of the book?
The book is a new look at Rabbi Jesus. On the top of the page, and then on the bottom, it's going to say, Jews and Christians finally reconnected. And I'm deliberately saying Rabbi Jesus. I know people don't agree or not whether he was a rabbi, and that's something we could talk about. But I chose that to show the Jewish connection, so that people who normally separate out, Jews are on one side and Christians are on another, and the truth is we're linked together whether we like it or not. The very first verse of Matthew, the Christian scriptures, New Testament, says there's a genealogy of Jesus to Christ. Christ means Messiah. son of David, son of Abraham. So, and then it gives you genealogies to prove that point. So it doesn't say, here's some man sort of walking down the road. We don't know what he is. We don't care. They say, no, he was son of David means he's from the line of Messiah, and then son of Abraham, which means he inherited the 2,000 years of Jewish history up to that point. So the Christian tradition is telling us with a loud voice, yes, he is a member of the Jewish community. And that's so important, I think, to have that background to show people where they came from.
You're obviously passionate about this topic, and you have a lot of interest in it. Now, we talked about this several weeks ago, but Leo Frank,
Right.
you know, was living in Atlanta, and for folks don't know the story, he was lynched in Marietta because Mary Fagan was murdered, and he was accused, went through a trial. Death penalty was commuted by the governor after some study. He was sent to try to separate him, and then a lynch mob went down from Marietta, brought him here to Marietta, and lynched him. And there were several interesting things, but part of it was this whole, there's Jews up in New York that are paying for his lawyers, he's going to get off, and there was this whole hysteria around it. What is your take, or what information can you provide from a Jewish perspective on that old story? It was 1915.
Yeah.
But what's your thoughts on those?
Well, I'll tell you, I think we need to broaden it out. One of the things historically that you could look at would be the Crusades, you could look at the Inquisition, and unfortunately even the Holocaust. And I think that Leo Frank is sort of a symbol of what sort of society exists when there's prejudice, in this case prejudice toward Jewish people. And I address that also in my book. I mean, Jews and money and Jews and influence and all that. I address that. It's simply an untruth. When I was in the Navy, we used to have charts, this before the internet, and you would look at your rank and your years in, and there's a number, and that's how much you got. That's what I was paid, nothing more, nothing less. So I think, unfortunately, it's interesting you asked me. I had another professor friend of mine. We had an elaborate ceremony at a local synagogue, and we planted a tree for Leo Frank. And the professor said to me, you know, at the same site that Leo Frank was lynched, there was a lot of African Americans lynched. And they also need a site to recall them. So I think prejudice is ugly. I mean, look at the world today and Europe, where they experienced the Holocaust. There's renewed anti-Semitism to a very large extent. And if I could just add, as a historian, I go back and forth between like history and religion. That phrase about if you don't study history, we're doomed to repeat it, I think is very active and very real. The Holocaust ended 70, 80 years ago. I mean, next year is the 75th anniversary of the liberating of Auschwitz, but that's a lifetime. I have a better one for you. When I was teaching in Kennesaw after 9/11, which was 2001, I didn't really have to teach about it for the first 10, 12 years because everyone was old enough to remember where they were and what happened. But when I go to class now and I say, raise your hand, even if you were born, then some people were not born. Or most of the people in the class were kindergartners, so they have no concept of that. So even an event like 9/11, which we say, well, everyone knows, not really. I mean, students obviously know it, but it becomes another page in a textbook which has to be taught to be fully understood. So that's 9/11. Now you go back to World War II, or you go back to the Crusades, or you go back to the beginning. And so in many ways, the enormity of the task that I have is trying to, not erase, but trying to wrestle with 1,900 years, maybe 2,000 years of this gigantic misunderstanding that there was animosity between Jesus and the Jews of the time. And the way I interpret it and try to prove to people that it was much more a family conversation, and it was like brothers maybe having different opinions about something, but it was all within the context of the Jewish community. And let's deal with it and move to a higher place of understanding.
I guess, too, what you're describing is there's like those bigger, higher political motivations for things. And it's, whether it's Jews or African American, folks get caught up in that part of it too, where it's not just, so it's a local thing, but it's also a national thing, and it's the fear and all those other things wrapped up into that one issue.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I teach about Tom Watson, who had a statue down near the Atlanta Capitol a few years ago. And if you read some of his writing, now remember, before...
So explain who Tom Watson is.
Tom Watson was the editor of a local newspaper here, and before the internet and TV and radio, most people received their news from the local newspaper. And he's writing incendiary, just horrible things about people of color and Jews, and just continuing to perpetuate some of these prejudices. And if you don't have a Jewish friend, if you don't have somebody you could turn to and push back against that, then you're reading it in something authoritative like a newspaper and saying, well, it must be true because this guy says so. So it's kind of scary. One of the things I've learned as a historian is that I believe the forces of prejudice are quite tenacious. So I'm not naive enough to say, well, with my nonprofit or my book, we're going to eliminate it, but I want to get into the struggle. And just like the internet can send people to some horrible websites that lead them to violence, I'm hoping we can equally send people to websites that will teach them this common past we have, and they'll be able to sort of push back intellectually and saying, no, we're not really against those people. We're all in this together. Mm-hmm. It's a big task, though, and we're really pushing back against history. The good news is that children are born with a clean slate. Mm-hmm. And so we're not born prejudiced yet. We learn it. So I'm hoping that we can teach people what Jesus says all the time: love your neighbor as yourself. Which comes from the book of Leviticus, which once again you learn as a Jewish kid. Because it's easy to say. It's 3 words: v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then you talk about what does that mean. If I'm in my house and my neighbor has a tree and it falls, okay, I'm going to run out and say, oh, what do you need, whatever. And I hope somebody would reciprocate. So it's just like that. It's not like some high theological idea. It's just very practical, day-by-day stuff. But that's where we live. It is sad. It is any sort of prejudice, and it's not just prejudice in talking. Understand, with Leo Frank, he was in a state prison. So he was locked up. So when I teach about the history of prejudice in America, you have this whole mini history of people who are broken out of jails and then hung. Well, they're in jail because they were already found guilty, so just let the legal system, which was already biased too, why not let that play out? But there was so much hatred that you're kind of breaking people out of jail and taking them back. I think that if we show people facts, not opinions, facts, about Jesus as a child, as a young man. Jewish kids are circumcised when they're born. Jesus was circumcised. The Bible says so. He had a bar mitzvah, which means coming of age. The book of Luke says so. He was educated as a Jewish man, as I said before. So I have evidence, and then we need to talk about what that means. Mm-hmm. The focal point of Christianity is Jesus and Paul also later. They're all Jewish. It was a Jewish endeavor. Christians are starting to, like if you go around Easter, Passover time, a number of churches have Seder meals because that's the Lord's Supper meal. So we're making our initial steps in that area, but we have to go from steps to running. And
I'm super excited. I got to know you, and it's been a total pleasure for me just to help you along your podcasting journey. And you can find Rabbi Jesus, my brother, on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. And the book will come out soon, right? When do you think?
Mid-October, if everything goes right. And, of course, our website is, if you Google the Jewish Christian Discovery Center, you'll find us. And I have a big project coming up for December. That'll be another podcast. But I really hope to have an impact on a very large segment of the population.
Well, I'm super excited to see what's coming up next, because this whole discussion to me is fascinating, and I loved having you on the show, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you very much. If you want information, just email me or reach out to me. You can get it through the website.
Yeah, and I'll put the links on the show notes. So thanks, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
You have been listening to the Marietta Stories podcast. Contact us at bill@mariettastories.com to let us know your show ideas. And don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play so you don't miss an episode.